If you're on the East Coast, good afternoon. We're just going to give it a minute here while people start logging on. Welcome to the ongoing webinar series from Results to Strategy. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started momentarily here. I see I have some old friends logging on, so it's good to see everyone pop in. Okay, we're going to get started here. So thank you for joining us. This is our first webinar in the new fall season here. And as you know, at Results for Strategy, we do an ongoing series of webinars that you have access to at all times. So today's conversation is about going beyond POS to deliver a unified food experience. So let me introduce our panelists, and then they'll go ahead and introduce themselves, give you a little bit of brief background. So I'm going to start off with Amir Huda from QPOS. Go ahead, Amir.
Thank you, Fred. Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Huda. I'm the CEO of Q. I've been a technology entrepreneur for the last 20 plus years, started and run 4 different technology companies. Prior to coming to Q, I was the founder and CEO of Brickstream, where we built customer analytics solutions for large global retailers. And it was funny, every time we'd get an opportunity to actually integrate the customer data with their POS data, the results would be so much better. But the kind of retailers we were working with, they would hold sort of the POS data like, keys to the kingdom. And when I got an opportunity to come to Q, it was really exciting because I was like a kid in a candy store. We're going to have access to all of this data. So really excited to be here and be here on the webinar today as well as at Q.
Great, thank you, Amir. All right, Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Lukianoff. I've been in data science in restaurants for about 20 years, since long before they coined the term data science. I've been started my career with a company called Revenue Management Solutions, working on pricing models for large chain restaurants. I started my own company called Czar Metrics, and worked the past 4 years for a company called Fishball as Chief Analytics Officer. My interest in really restaurant technology has been in taking in the data and building predictive models, which right now is becoming even more important because all of the automation and all of the AI technology and so on and so forth that's becoming more important in restaurants is really going to be driven by how all of these systems are able to talk to each other. So data is really going to be the foundation for all of that going forward.
That's great. We're excited to have both of you on the panel for today. So just to let all the audience know, you can ask questions throughout the panel. I know that everyone's busy checking emails or eating a sandwich at their desk if they're on the East Coast. But if you look on your panel on the right-hand side, there's a spot for you to ask questions. We will field those questions and ask them along the way. So you can do so at any time. You will get a recorded copy of this as well for your use. And as I said earlier, if you go to Results to Strategy's website, you'll be able to get other webinars that we put on throughout our time together. So our discussion point today is to sort of say, where are we today with POS? A lot of discussion around the POS system, a lot of disruption in the POS system, from legacy software and hardware companies to now cloud-based POS. But we're also going to talk about whether or not POS matches the needs of an ever-changing consumer. For the restaurant industry, we're experiencing a tremendous growth in omni-channel. And what I mean by omni-channel is we have 5 sales channels in the restaurant business. We have on-premise, we have takeaway, we have drive-through, we have delivery, we have catering. And of course, a lot of the buzz is in delivery, but the other ones are growing as well. And it changes how people interact with POS. We'll be getting into that later on. And then just talking about what's good enough versus best in class, as people with third-party vendors that like to use a more robust system rather than what's offered by the POS systems. How does that work? And then we'll be discussing the unified food experience as Amir has envisioned it. So Amir, give us the big starting point. Where are we? This is a great picture that I think was taken when you were a young man, right?
It was taken just last year, I think, if I'm not mistaken. No, just kidding. The restaurant technology industry really it reminds me of how things can get outdated very quickly when you don't have the right investment available or the right margins available to keep up with the ever-changing technology landscape. And so the way the industry has really thought about technology has always been sort of front of the house and back of the house technology, where front of the house has been sort of the customer facing when somebody walks into, so to speak, your house and orders food at the counter or at the table. And that, the technology associated with that was typically all sort of lumped into front of the house. And things were relatively simple back then because there were no 5 order channels at that time. And the back of the house world was related to your accounting and your HR, inventory, if you were sophisticated to do automated inventory management or even labor management or scheduling. And those, 2 technology platforms were sort of independent. And I think where we are today is a lot has changed, and this paradigm in our minds is a little outdated. We really have to start thinking about it differently, and we'll certainly talk more about that as we move forward here.
No, that's great. And of course, this is before the internet. This is before fax machines, before cell phones. So the world has changed. We're going to see whether POS has changed along with it. So Mike, you've got a strong view in terms of what's going on with the way the industry has evolved in this era of disruption. Why don't you share your view with us, please?
Yeah, I think that there's some real challenges with how the industry is actually going to be able to get out of this technology rut. There's so much innovation going on out there, and there's been so much dependence on the POS vendors to really be the platform that helps to lead the innovation, largely because it's been the largest single technology investment that most restaurateurs make. But there's some really fundamental problems with that, in that the POS companies have just a misalignment with the restaurant companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. There's also a misunderstanding with a lot of the technology companies as to what the complexity of the restaurant business is. It is not a retailer. Is a very different kind of business, and oftentimes they think that they can approach it exactly the same as a brick and mortar retailer, and you simply can't, because there's a different kind of complexity, and it's getting more complex by the day. I would say that there are innovative POS companies that could potentially lead the change, but they need to change their frame of mind from being sort of the POS, the register, front of house type of company. And if they can do that, then they could be part of the change or even lead the change, but they really need to change the fundamental thinking as to what they are and how they contribute to the technology stack.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in reality, the early stage POS companies were probably more hardware manufacturers with some operating software just to make sure that the register drawer opened. And it's evolved a lot because now the new cloud-based systems are mostly software driven, right? They're hardware agnostic. In fact, hardware is just a commodity. There's nothing special about it. And of course, I always crack up at the fact that consumer products have influenced POS design so much. As soon as the iPad came out, everybody wanted their POS system to look like an iPad. It was like having the old-fashioned square box TVs on your counter. It just didn't make any more sense. So that's really changing dramatically.
I think that's exactly right, Fred. And I think that, when all these new generation POS companies started to come on board, who understood software, it started to look really, really promising. but I think what ended up happening is that all of them either got purchased by or became so focused on being payment processors, and that became the revenue model. That completely changed the focus. So when you think about what incentivizes a payment processor, it's not being the innovation engine or the central computing system inside a restaurant. So I think that incentive model, is a strike against the modern generation of most POS companies from actually being the innovation engine for restaurants.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. So
Yeah, I think Fred, if I can chime in there, Mike, I think you bring up a very important point. I've been with Q now about 2 years, and I'm just shocked at how many POS companies are either acquired by payment processors or are payment processors masquerading as POS companies, and it's just hard to tell who's who in this very integrated landscape of POS and payment processors. And you mentioned, Fred, this question about how hardware went from POS companies went from being just the hardware companies to now being software companies. Both of those have models have challenges in our mind. I think the payment landscape really complicates what the customer is really looking to accomplish with a POS company. And when you start to mix payment with that, it muddies the waters. And we believe that customers should have choice, not just choice in payment processing, but also choice in hardware and choice in all kinds of different decisions that they have to make. So we believe that the more choice you give customers and help them make the right decisions, the easier it's going to get for them. And Mike, your point about sort of POS companies have not been able to deliver in the past, and part of that is we really need to take a step back and think about what do we think of a POS company when we say POS. That question itself has become very fundamental, and I think unless POS companies can do a lot more than what they've been doing, even in the recent past, we're not going to have a true solution for restaurant operators. And that's kind of what I believe the industry really needs to take that next step forward.
that's great. So Mike, finish up the thoughts here. We know that the incentives for the POS companies have shifted based on what their ownership group is, but you have some views in terms of where the money lies in the restaurant industry.
Yeah, there's a second misalignment, I think, in the economics, right, of where, say the deep pockets or the money is in where technology is being invested in the restaurant companies themselves. And you're seeing huge amounts of money going into loyalty programs and all of these customer-facing technologies, and that's largely because the huge amount of the restaurant investment spend is in the franchise ad funds. The franchise ad funds, a lot of them, went all into TV advertising and radio advertising. And with the drop in effectiveness of TV and radio and traditional advertising, a lot of this money is has lost its way, and the mandate of those funds haven't necessarily changed. So you're seeing, though, that people are reshifting, and that investment is going into things that are revenue generating, like loyalty and so forth. But there's a misalignment with some of the other technologies now that could actually drive a more holistic change in the experience that the customer needs. And that's not necessarily being driven, because in order to get into that kind of funding, you need to prove that you're revenue generating, not necessarily, say, holistically changing the customer experience.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. All these technologies that are coming about, as you call them, guest-facing technologies and back office systems and different things. It reminds me a bit of menu creep in restaurant menus. You have so many items the kitchen can't put them out anymore, and I think that's what's happening a little bit in our industry as we start looking at it. So let's talk a little bit about how that works out, all these different sales channels and all these different systems. So Amir, what's your view of this?
Well, before I talk about my view on sort of the current state of affairs, I do want to point out one of the challenges when we think about economics. Think of what's happened just in the past few weeks. We've seen just, I think it was yesterday, Sweet Green announced that they're going to be investing $150 million in technology. How many locations do they have? 100, 200 maybe? Think about the per location investment that they're making. Think about what McDonald's has done in just the past few weeks with the acquisitions that they're doing. And I just saw an article yesterday where McDonald's is talking about themselves as a technology company more than a food company. So if you're competing with a Sweet Green in the healthy food space, or you're competing with McDonald's in the QSR space, think about the ramifications to you from a technology investment perspective if you want to keep up in this ever increasing budget and technology needs that they have just to stay with some of the changes that are happening in the industry. So I'd like to sort of keep that at the back of our minds as we think about where the industry is today. The amount of money required is changing dramatically, and we have seen some brands that are starting to take a step back and say, you know what, we need to go beyond thinking about just the marketing funds that we've been charging our franchisees. And some of them have started adding to that and adding technology funds and technology fees because they recognize that without that, they're going to get outdated very quickly. So coming to the state of the affairs, I think this is a great segue into sort of the needs of technology and the economics of that. I think, Fred, you mentioned earlier there are 5 different order channels, right? The world was simple when it was a store, and in the store, people walked in and placed their order, and if it had a drive-through, you had a second order channel there. But for the most part, it was built by the same vendor that built the in-store platform, and life was not too difficult. As consumer needs evolved and online ordering came in, that created a second, what I call a menu system. And by menu system, it's not just, what you're selling, but where you're selling it. Different franchisees might be taking or not taking certain items of the menu or adding to that. They might be pricing it differently. The taxes are certainly different. The promotions are different in different geographies and locations. All of those things comprise one menu system. So when you add online ordering and you create a second menu system, which is built on a different technology stack by different companies that have created it, it creates complexity. And that's when a lot of the cloud-based POS companies came about and said, we will give you APIs that you will be able to integrate into best in class. And I think that was exactly the right approach. Unfortunately, if you fast forward, 5, 10 years from when that started, you start to realize that not all APIs are created equal. And when APIs are one directional, they're only designed to take an order from an online platform or from a catering platform into the POS, you start to see that you are only solving half the problem, but you're creating a lot more problems in the process. And then, mobile ordering and order ahead came about, and then kiosks came about, and all of these technologies were built by different companies, and everything now had to be integrated. We hosted CEOs from 12 different companies about 4 months ago now, and we were talking about some of the challenges that they're seeing. And I walked away from there thinking, these people are struggling with someone defined it as menu mayhem, and someone defined it as menu rage, menu management madness. I mean, you should have seen the look on the faces of these CEOs, and they said, how do we run our business when we have so many different menu systems across so many platforms? And then when third-party delivery came in, guess what? They pretty much blew up the entire industry because they had the investment to take control of the entire restaurant industry. And guess what? Restaurant operators jumped in with both feet because it was and is and continues to be an opportunity to increase your revenues. But in the process, they've lost control of the brand, they've lost control of the production experience, and they've introduced a lot more challenges. So now you have a whole bunch of new companies coming in and saying, we've got the answer for you. We can integrate across all these third-party delivery systems and your online ordering and your catering. But sometimes I say, let's hold off and make sure that we're doing it the right way. These APIs need to be bidirectional. If all they're doing is taking an order and pushing it into your POS, that's what we did 10 years ago with online ordering. How are we solving the problem? If you cannot have a menu management system that can feed things into the third-party delivery systems, that can feed things into your online ordering, into your kiosk, and into your store from a single platform and from a single database, you're not really solving the challenges that you've had for the last 5 or 10 years. And that's where we come in with sort of these broken promises, right? APIs are phenomenal when they're designed correctly and they're used correctly, but that unfortunately hasn't been the case, certainly in the past. Cloud technologies, right? Everybody said cloud is going to be the panacea. We're going to solve all your problems because we're going to get rid of that server in the store. You know, that's like 1980s technology. You don't need that server anymore. Again, great promise. But when you think about how that's been implemented, it's not uniform, right? I've seen so many situations where the cloud is overused. For example, there are some companies that use the cloud for everything. So when you walk in as a guest, you place an order for what you want to eat, the order goes into the cloud and then comes back into the kitchen. Well, guess what? If your cloud is down, your internet is down, any one of those scenarios, your kitchen is down. So we have to be a little smart about how we use the cloud. There are other cloud-based companies that will say, you know what? We've come from this background of client server, and we need to have the concept of a server in the store. And they take one terminal and they make it into a master. And guess what happens when your master terminal is down? Even though you're cloud-based, you're still down because your other terminals can't talk to the master anymore. So these are some of the challenges that, as POS vendors, to be honest with you, we've all collectively created some of these challenges, and it's now time to step up and really say, okay, this is how we're going to address those challenges, and that's what we're trying to do, what we're hoping to do.
No, that's great. So, Mike, let's take a different view of this a little bit. I think Amir did a good job sort of sharing from a technologist perspective. So let's go back a little bit to that original store model. What do we got here?
Yeah, I'll just sort of simply talking a little bit about the idea of POS, right? And POS, if you just think fundamentally of what it originally was just a register system. How do I accept cash from people, and how do they queue up, and how do I accept money from people in an old style way of doing commerce? And of course, the complexity of that is just getting exponentially, more, out of control, not just in restaurants, but in brick and mortar. And if we think of the classic POS, and as that extends into the in-store experience now, when you've got sensors, when you've got table management systems, when you've got the entire experience, you've got facial recognition systems, you've got all these kinds of things that are happening on the in-store experience. But the thing that is much different about a restaurant, that is completely different than any other retailer, is that a restaurant is really a real-time food manufacturing plant, right? Most retailers, what comes in the back door is the same thing that goes out the front door, with very little change happening inside the four walls. There's actually a real-time manufacturing plant inside every restaurant. And that adds tremendous complexity, especially when you think about how new automation, robotics, and all of these things are going to happen within the restaurants and are already happening. In order for that to happen, all of these disparate systems that are not able to talk to one another, or being pasted together or duct taped together through APIs, where your central sort of nervous system is the POS that was designed to really just be the storefront, it's just completely insufficient to be able to paste everything together. It's not what it was ever designed for.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. In fact, we're going to see here, you can talk about it. I mean, this is just a small sample of just how technology has really come into the space. And that's why, CTOs and CEOs are confused, because how do you make a decision on who to pick? There are so many different things you can spend money on. As I tell technology companies, when they say, well, we're only $100 a month, I go, yeah, but if I got 15 of those, that's a lot of money. It adds up fast per location. Not to mention Amir's point about the kind of money that Sweetgreen says they're going to be paying.
So this is a graphic from CB Insights that I just loved. It's kind of old, but it's just it just gives a snapshot of how many vendors are out there with so many silos. And when you're in the data business and insights business like I am, I'm just looking at all of this and with experience knowing that each one of these is a separate silo of data. They don't talk to each other very well. And even when they do have an API, whether there's a toll that you've got to pay to connect them or not, there's valuable data that's being lost with every connection. So this network of all these different connections, and some of them don't even allow a connection because there's still plenty of walled gardens out there that don't let you in and there's no connection. So this mess of vendors, while there's tremendous innovation going on out there, you're also losing enormous amounts of data, and there's no central platform that is really able to produce an ecosystem that allows all of these different vendors to be able to work in harmony for the benefit of the restaurants in an economically efficient way.
Yeah, and this graphic here illustrates, in the blue, it's the B2B operation systems, and the outer ring is the guest experience. You know, with the phenomena of third-party delivery, where people have gone through tablet hell, because if they're not using a sole proprietor or you know, exclusively using 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 different companies, they end up just inundating themselves with problems. Not everyone is connected to the POS system, and that's really the issue. Is when I talk to companies about who they're integrated with, many of them just will easily talk about the cloud-based ones, but not the legacy ones, because Micros and Aloha are a little bit tougher to get into because of those the APIs that we keep on talking about, which is, for those of you who don't understand what an API is, it's the way that the two systems talk to each other and try and share that data. And that's what makes it very, very confusing for people. And, you know, as we've been talking about it, is like, where do you go from here?
Yeah, I think, Fred, you know, on this point about, you mentioned, you know, every vendor walks in and wants $100 for their technology, and pretty soon you do the math and you realize there are not enough $100 bills available to address all the technology needs that you have, and you have to start to prioritize. And really the prioritization needs to come in terms of thinking about what's going to help me generate more revenue. Where am I going to get the best bang for the limited dollars that I have? Because there's just not enough money in the restaurant industry. When you look at all the costs that they have to deal with from a labor perspective, from a real estate perspective, none of that is changing. It's going to get more and more expensive to run your business. And there's going to be a ceiling on how much people are willing to pay for their food. So you're going to have to prioritize. You know, that the slide that you had before this one is daunting to think about how many different technology platforms are there to address all the needs of restaurants. And you're just going to have to pick and choose. And I think it's going to have to come from a revenue perspective. You just have to start to think about, you know, what spend is going to generate more revenue. And you know, Mike, I'd like to get your thoughts on sort of how you integrate across all of these and which ones are more important. Especially the slide that you have up here is pretty interesting from our perspective, just because it talks about all the different systems that need to come together.
Well, yeah, and I think to your point, Amir, about all the different vendors and all the different $100 bills that you got to shell out each month to engage with each one of them. So many of them are using the exact same data set, but they specify the data slightly differently. So, you know, and the same thing with this different sensor vendors. How many different, if you want to have sensors to control your refrigerator and sensors for your security system and sensors to eventually work in tandem with your loyalty programs, and you know, how many different sensor hubs are you going to need inside your four walls, and how many different vendors are you going to have to pay for it, right? So if you think about all of these different things, from your commerce systems and your in-store experience and your labor systems, all of these are using very common, in terms of the data that they're spinning off, many of them are using very common data systems. And I think that, you know, when you talk, Amir, about consolidating, having just uniform product. Most other industries have a uniform product code, and that simplifies everything. But because restaurants are a manufacturing plant, there is no UPC code for starters, and the SKUs that are coming in the back door are not the same as the PLUs that are going out the front door. So identifying what the ingredients are that are going into the product and then are going out, there's an enormous complexity there, but it's not impossible, right? If there are uniform standards and there is a centralized computing system, and at least one that's capturing all the data from each one of these systems, then you've got at least a foundation for being able to create the integration and be able to support the different systems. But when there's tolls between each one of these, then it makes the economics of having a unified system impossible. So I would put this challenge to Amir and people like you, Amir, to define what the next generation of the real, I think, centralized computing system is for restaurants.
No, that's a good point, because I mean it takes us to sort of the reality of where we are today. How do operators move forward? How do they go to a place where they can really, again, to go beyond POS, and as Amir likes to call it, unified food experiences. As we now know, the disintermediation of POS is a result of the fourth screen. The first screen was movie theaters, the second screen was television sets, the third screen was our PCs and laptops, and now we have the fourth screen, our mobile device, that allows one-to-one communication with our guests and engagement. But at the same time, in effect, we've given control of the system to our guests, and they're the ones that are really driving a lot of the change. So Amir, what's your view of this?
Well, I think, the first thing POS companies need to do is acknowledge that the POS is no longer a point of sale. It is virtual. It's wherever the guests are. Think about all of us, right? There are times when we'll walk into a restaurant to order food. There are other times we'll be sitting at work and ordering using our laptops, or driving and using our mobile device to order ahead, or using voice even to call ahead, using our tablets when we are sitting on a couch to order, right? All of those have different ways of ordering and interfacing with the POS. So you have to stop thinking about the POS as the center of the universe. We all, as POS vendors, have to stop thinking and talking about the POS as the center of the universe. The place where operators need to start is really on the inside, at the core. If you don't have a single repository, your data is going to be siloed, and if your data is siloed, you can't make business decisions in a timely manner, and you certainly cannot make decisions that are revenue impacting. So that's kind of how we think about the future POS. When we talk about going beyond, when we talk about creating unified food experiences, it's really addressing those challenges.
Okay.
So this is actually that screen that you had up there. This is a great example of all the different ways that we as consumers would like to, and today we do interact with restaurants. And voice is just coming on the scene, right? Think about the investments that are going to have to go in. If you have different technology platforms for in-store and drive-through and catering and kiosks and mobile and third-party delivery, and now you say, you know what, I want to offer my guests the choice to use the voice. Each of those platforms is going to implement voice differently. I've talked to some large vendors where voice companies have gone to them and said, it's going to cost us $500,000 just to do a proof of concept. And that, by the way, is only going to be for one of your channels. It's just not manageable. So if you don't have a single platform to consolidate all of your order processes and your production processes, and a new technology like voice comes about, there's no sane way for you to integrate voice into your experiences, because your technology platforms are so siloed.
So Amir, how do you make a decision on what you're going to do when you have all this stuff to select from? I mean, that's really the big question for people.
I think like I said earlier, in order to make a decision of what to select, you first have to say, what problem am I looking to solve? If you think about this as just technology for my point of sale, you're almost asking the wrong question. In this world that we are today, where revenues are flat or maybe growing slightly if you're in fast casual and quick service, maybe going down if you're in table service, unless you're a really strong brand, you've got to ask, what can I do to help my top line? And is there a way for me to make rational decisions about my technology costs? Because if I have to spend for each one of these as separate platforms, like we said earlier, there are not enough $100 bills to go around. So think about platforms where you can consolidate your order processes. Think about platforms where you can consolidate your menu management, because that is costing real dollars. I've talked to companies where they have teams of people just managing menus across either multiple brands or even within a brand across all the different channels. And even then, they're doing a lot of things manually because these APIs were not created bi-directional. So I think that's how you need to look at it: is, are there ways for me to pick a technology platform where I don't have to pay $100 every time I need to add a new channel? And number two, does that technology platform give me a unified repository from which I can really make decisions to increase my revenues? We talked about loyalty earlier on. Think about the challenges of integrating loyalty, right? If you have loyalty and I as a consumer log in and I have access to my points and my rewards and I have my favorites and all of that stored, and then I walk in and I use your kiosk, and guess what? All of that is lost or non-existent, or if I, don't have a single place where all that information is stored. So you really have to step back and say, how do I integrate and create a unified data store where I have a single view of my customer? If your customer is going to be spread across all your different platforms, you're never going to be able to make revenue impacting decisions in a timely manner.
Right. Good point. Good point. So
I would add a couple of things to that, Fred. I think just because I've seen a lot of mistakes made that are very short term. One, especially I think with a lot of the new emergent technologies that are coming on, people will look at it and they'll say, hey, I can get into this technology for X per month, and that's cheap. So it seems like a great idea because they can just jump right into it and there's not a lot of money down. So, X per month per store seems like a great idea. So it's really easy because it's not very expensive. But if you're a growing concept, that could end up being extremely expensive, especially as Amir is saying, for every connection, it's another $100 per month for every single thing that you add. And it's a walled garden, so everything that you want to add has to go through them, and they've got inferior solutions for everything that you add. And increasingly we're seeing there's companies out there that think that your data is their data, and that's a really dangerous thing to get into, because your data is actually the lifeblood of your company increasingly, and more so in the future. So these are the things that you really need to be looking at when you decide what sort of systems you're going to put in place. You can't just be looking at the next quarter and the next year. You need to be looking at, out a couple years in advance and thinking about what the connections are, what you want to achieve in your total technology solution, not just what it's going to cost me on a monthly basis now.
Yeah, and that's the controversy with third-party deliveries, where they're basically stealing your customer and then running them back to you, to quote my friend Zach Goldstein from Thanks. So that's definitely one of the things that's going on there. So Amir, let's go back to you. So what you're trying to do is have this unified experience, right? Why don't you just explain that to us?
Yeah, if you actually, this slide, go back one slide. I think this is a good segue into what we mean by a unified food experience. And I want to bring this to life with an example that I experienced myself. So we've talked already about sort of the front of the food, right? We as consumers are in front of the food because we interact with brands through all these different order channels. And when there are inconsistencies and these order channels are not running on the same technology platform, there are mistakes that are made that are immediately visible and obvious to us as consumers. But there's something happening sort of what we call behind the food, where the production experience is taking a toll on the brands. And that's because of third-party delivery. I was at a Subway about 3 or 4 weeks ago when I was traveling. It was end of the day, about 7:30, 8 in the evening. I walked into a Subway. I was the only guest there, and there was one cashier slash food preparer, one employee, and I placed my order and I stood on the side and he started making my sandwich, or what I thought was my sandwich. Turned out it was not. He wrapped it up and he put it on the side and he started making the next sandwich, which I thought would be my sandwich, but it was not. And I stepped up and I said, "Excuse me, I'm waiting for my sandwich." And he said, "Yeah, just 1 minute. I got just 3 more to do because the delivery guy is going to be here to pick up this order." And I'm like, "Dude, I took the trouble to come into your restaurant and you're telling me that you're going to prioritize a delivery order." And then I realized after I eventually got my sandwich and I walked out, I'm like, there's no point getting mad at that guy. That's not his fault. He's living the tablet hell that you talked about. And there are orders coming in and there's no way to prioritize. There's no way to sanitize this madness that has been created because technology systems are not integrated, and so you don't have a way to make any rational decisions. And then think about when the food actually does get delivered. If it's late, if it's cold, if the order is not right. We all know that mistakes happen in orders, right? Even when we're standing right there, sometimes they forget to put the tomatoes, or they forget to take out the onions or whatever, right? Now you're sitting at home and your food comes to you. Guess what? That whole brand experience has been hijacked. And so the way we think about solving this problem is you've got to unify your order experience across all your channels. You've got to unify your production experience across those channels, and you've got to address the brand experience. And if you do all of that together, then you can start to create what we call a unified food experience.
That's great. That's very helpful. And so basically here you're talking about the opportunity to do it all through one platform, as you talked about earlier, right? So that it's all holistically united, one source for all the data for the multiple sales channels we discussed, and go on from there.
That's right. I think you really have to start with the one data, right? And having that unified data store. Otherwise, if your data is siloed, your revenue generation is going to be impacted for sure. But in order to have that, you really need a single core, right? When you think of all these orders coming in, if the orders are not being processed uniformly with the same core engine, you really, from an engine perspective, it shouldn't care whether the order was an online order, a third-party delivery order, or an in-store order. But that's the reality today. But if you can get to a single unified core with a single set of APIs that were designed to be bi-directional, not just take data from third-party systems, but be able to push data back into the third-party delivery system. When you want to make changes in pricing, when you want to make changes in menu items, if you don't have that bi-directional connection, you're going to be back to where you were 5 years ago when you started to implement online ordering on your own website. So that's kind of where we think the real decisions have to be made, is what's under the hood, if you will.
And Mike, for you to have that single source of data would make your life a lot easier. You're trying to do menu analytics and price elasticity studies, I would assume.
Yeah, no, it would completely change the economics of being able to do that too. It's shocking how difficult it is just to be able to identify, within a chain's POS data, this is a cheeseburger. There are still so many restaurants that don't even have that uniformity of their product schema down, and all of that needs to be corrected before you can even start doing an effective analysis on the POS data. And now with the channels getting even more complex, that becomes even more difficult, because lots of restaurants now are saying, hey, should I be charging the same thing for my delivery menu or my drive-through menu as my in-store or my pickup, and so on and so forth? And the answer is, yeah, maybe not. certainly not for delivery. So the tide's really changing. So I think that what Q is doing with the total, say the menu management across multiple channels, it's going to be a mandatory type of system in the very near future for anybody who wants to actually implement any kind of a real revenue management system or yield management type of system in the very near future.
So Amir, let me ask you a question as we sort of start wrapping it up. 5 years from now, is Q going to call themselves a POS company, or are they going to be something else?
So to be honest, we don't even think about ourselves as a traditional POS company today. As you know, our branding is all about beyond POS, and that was very intentional because we feel that POS companies need to go beyond and think differently from the way we've all been thinking historically. And for us, going beyond POS is really starting to think about, let's look inside. Where is your data going to be? Can I leverage that data across different order channels? If I want to add voice, can I, do that in an easy, seamless manner? If I want to do analytics, like what Mike was talking about, how many different sources of data do I have to go into to normalize things? I was with a company that has over 1,000 locations, and they said they have 8,000 items. I'm like, it is not possible for you to have even 100 items. But in the database, that gets represented as 1,000 items when every channel has to create its own menus. And then somebody wants to, some franchisee wants to offer a different topping or a different ingredient or a different price. It has to be replicated. And then when somebody brings in experts to sort of analyze that data, where do you start? You've got the same item represented 100 different ways. You're still selling the same item, but try analyzing your business and how many of that item are you selling. Very, very challenging today. And so it all comes down to, you got to create a single source of truth. And to do that, you got to look on the inside first and think about how it's going to impact your revenue, not think about it as a POS platform to take orders.
Oh, that's excellent. So as we wrap up our webinar today, as you said, we reviewed the current state of affairs, which sounds like a bit of a mess. And we know why, coming out of legacy hardware to software to the ever-changing consumers and the disruption going through right now, and discussing how do we have an open API and a better database to allow for these decisions to be made. This whole concept of the unified food experience for our on-demand customer, where they are, where they want it, how they want it, when they want it, is changing the world. So I think we have a good idea of what the future looks like, but it's going to be fascinating to see how it evolves. So I do want to thank Amir and Mike for joining me today. For all of you in the audience, thank you so much. We'll be getting you a copy of this later on, and don't forget to join us for our next webinar. Have a wonderful afternoon and good speaking to all of you.
Thank you, Fred and Mike. Great to share the panel with you.
Thanks, everyone.